The issue of misclassification, Part Two. When critics use the term misclassification, they are referring to circumstances in which an investigator misclassifies a quote-unquote innocent person as guilty based on their verbal and nonverbal behaviors as exhibited during an investigative interview. And they are using for the foundation of that assessment the fact that numerous academic behavioral studies suggest that individuals, including trained investigators, are essentially no better than chance, 50-50, at accurately identifying a subject's credibility or truthfulness based on their verbal and nonverbal behaviors as exhibited during the investigative interview. This, in fact, is what most research studies have found. However, there are a number of problems with the vast majority. For example, the overwhelming number of academic studies are flawed in their design. And secondly, the studies generally did not follow the established protocol and the guidelines for the evaluation of a subject's behavior. For example, in many of the academic studies, they used students as quote-unquote subjects in their mock crime scenarios. Some of the students were assigned to be, for example, guilty of going into the teacher's office and stealing money out of his or her desk, and other students were assigned to be innocent of committing that theft. A number of the guilty suspects were subsequently told to lie about their involvement when they were interviewed by one of the staff research members. In reaching their conclusions as to who was a truthful subject and who was a deceptive individual, the evaluators, the researchers, who conducted the interviews of the subjects were generally no better than chance flipping a coin at determining the subject's status. In this type of academic research study, the subjects, as you can imagine, had very low levels of motivation to be believed or to avoid detection. There was no significant consequence if their deception, for example, was identified. Whereas in the real world, a subject may be facing loss of job, being charged with a crime, going to jail, being embarrassed in front of his family or friends if they found out what he did, etc. So there's a high motivation to establish their innocence or to hide their guilt. Furthermore, in several of the academic research studies, there was no opportunity for the interviewer to ask the subject follow-up questions after the subject told their original story. For example, in one study, inmates are on camera describing two different crimes that they committed, one which they actually did commit, and the second one which they are lying about they did not commit. And from having looked at this monologue presentation of crime 1 and crime 2, the investigator is supposed to determine which is the truthful statement and which is the false statement. The evaluators in that study were no better than chance flipping a coin at identifying which was the true crime the individual committed and which one was the crime they were lying about. But here's the distinction between a real-life investigation and this academic study. In the academic study, the reviewers watched a video of the monologue, "I committed this crime," and a video of a second monologue, "I also committed this crime." In a real investigative situation, once they would tell us that story, we would ask a series of follow-up questions to develop additional information and details. And it's oftentimes during that follow-up questioning when a subject's lack of candor may become apparent. For example, in the inmate study, there were no follow-up questions whatsoever. Here are some additional problems with many of the academic studies. The interviews of the subject were not conducted by investigators trained in investigative interviewing techniques. And the studies generally did not employ the type of structured interview process that is commonly used by investigators in the field. As mentioned, there are very few, if any, follow-up questions, which are the core of many investigative interviews. In academic studies, there are generally no attempt to establish a behavioral baseline for each subject so as to identify any subsequent changes from their normal behavioral pattern as they answered investigative questions. This is essential in an effort to evaluate a subject's credibility, because if we don't know what the normal verbal and nonverbal behaviors are, we're essentially flying blind in any attempt to establish information relative to their credibility. The following example illustrates the importance and the absolute need to establish a subject's normal verbal and nonverbal behavioral pattern before conducting the investigative interview process. During this particular interview, the subject is not listening to the investigator, is constantly fidgeting in the chair, tapping his hands on the table, squirming around, has poor eye contact, talks excessively, and oftentimes blurts out an answer before the question is even completed. Now, when we see that in an interview, we may be thinking, man, this guy seems very, very nervous. This might be the guy who did it. On the other hand, these same behaviors can be illustrated by somebody diagnosed with ADHD. So if we didn't have their normal, which is oftentimes developed during the early part of the interview where we're talking about background information, engaging in casual conversation, that kind of thing, observing how the person responds, what kind of verbal characteristics do they have, do they maintain eye contact, how quickly or slowly do they respond, etc. Without that baseline or norm, we don't know what we're getting. And typically, in the majority of academic research studies, there wasn't any substantial effort to establish that normal behavioral pattern. Furthermore, in many of the academic research studies, they were based on the faulty premise that there are specific behaviors unique to truth or deception. There are no behaviors unique to truth or deception. Just because the guy's looking us in the eye does not necessarily mean he's telling the truth. Just because the person is avoiding eye contact when they answer does not necessarily mean they're not telling the truth. We have to look at it in context against their normal behavioral baseline. In almost all of the academic research studies, there was no consideration given to the various effects that can affect a person's behavioral responses, such as age, maturity, cultural influences, mental capacity, emotional and psychological stability, the subject's physical condition at the time of the interview, etc. Again, without considering the possible impact of these various factors, we can be totally misreading the information we're getting. Furthermore, in most academic research studies, the interviewers were conducted in a vacuum. It was just the interview. When a real-world investigation, the interview is part of the investigative process. For example, by the time we interview this particular subject, we may have already developed information about the subject's relationship with the victim, their whereabouts at the time of the crime, their financial situation, or other related background information. In the Reid technique, we teach that there are several rules that all investigators should follow in the evaluation of a subject's verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Establish the subject's behavioral baseline and norm, and then look for changes from that. Read all behavioral responses across all three channels of communication: verbal, paralinguistic, and nonverbal. Look at what we call behavioral clusters, the overall behavioral pattern, not just one thing they do or say. Consider the timing and consistency of nonverbal responses. And always evaluate behavior in conjunction with the case, facts, and evidence. If these rules are followed, the subject's verbal and nonverbal behaviors can be very helpful in the evaluation of their credibility. Unfortunately, almost without exception, these assessment rules were not followed in the vast majority of the academic research studies that attempted to ascertain if investigators can assess a person's credibility based on their verbal and nonverbal behaviors. As we stated in part one of this tip, the most important element in evaluating a subject's potential culpability in the committing of a crime or an act of wrongdoing is not their behavioral responses, although they can be very helpful in guiding the interview where we have to ask follow-up questions, etc. But the most essential part is the content of their statement as compared to the case, facts, and evidence. Do the case, facts, and evidence support and lend credibility to their statement, or do they contradict what the subject is telling us? Thank you very much for taking a few minutes to view this program. On our website at reid.com, under the resource button on the home page, you'll find numerous investigators' tips that deal with conducting the investigative interview and the persuasion process.